Somewhere right now, someone is lying awake, doing the math on a decade, a job never applied for, the person never told how they felt, the conversation that could have repaired something before it was too late. Somewhere else, someone carries a different kind of regret entirely, not for something left undone, but for something they did and would take back in an instant if the years allowed it. Both of them are living with the same basic fact. Some doors, once closed, do not reopen. This episode is about what to actually do with that fact, because pretending it isn't true has never once made it less true. There's a common piece of advice, repeated so often it rarely gets questioned. No regrets. Live so boldly, so presently, that regret never has anything to attach to. This is a nice sentiment and an inaccurate description of an honest human life. Nearly everyone who has lived long enough carries some genuine regret, a choice they'd make differently, a chance they'd take, a word they'd finally say. Pretending otherwise doesn't produce a more examined life. It usually produces a less examined one, where regret gets suppressed rather than actually faced. Regret, examined honestly rather than denied, turns out to be far more useful than the no regrets philosophy gives it credit for. Stripped of the shame usually attached to it, regret is best understood as information, a signal pointing directly at what a person actually values, revealed specifically by the gap between what they did and what, looking back, they wish they'd done. Picture someone who deeply regrets not spending more time with a parent before that parent passed away. This regret, painful as it is, reveals something real and useful. How much that relationship actually mattered, more clearly than almost anything else could have shown it. Regret, in this sense, isn't just pain about the past. It's a uniquely honest map of a person's genuine priorities, often clearer in hindsight than it ever was in the actual moment of choosing. Regret generally splits into two distinct categories, and understanding the difference matters enormously for what to actually do about each one. Regret over things done, and regret over things left undone. Picture someone who regrets a specific action, a harsh word said, a decision made in anger, a choice that caused real harm. This regret is usually sharp, immediate, and tied to a specific, identifiable moment. Now picture someone who regrets an absence, the career never pursued, the relationship never attempted, the risk never taken. This regret tends to be vaguer, more diffuse, and often grows heavier with time rather than fading, because it's attached not to a single moment, but to an entire unexplored possibility that keeps expanding in the imagination the longer it goes unaddressed. There's a specific, well-documented pattern worth understanding directly. Over the long run, people tend to regret their inactions more than their actions, even when the actions caused real, immediate pain at the time. Picture two people, years later, reflecting on their past. One took a real risk, started a business, pursued a difficult relationship, moved somewhere unfamiliar, and it failed, causing real difficulty at the time. The other never took the equivalent risk at all, staying safely where they were. The person whose risk failed often reports less enduring regret than the person who never tried, because a failed attempt at least comes with a resolved story. What happened, what was learned, an ending, however disappointing. An unexplored possibility never resolves. It stays permanently open in the imagination, available to be endlessly, painfully reimagined in whatever ideal form the mind chooses to give it. While regret, examined honestly, carries genuine value, there's a real danger in staying there too long. A specific difference between visiting regret for what it can teach and moving in permanently. Picture someone who replays a specific decision from years ago, repeatedly, in painstaking detail, as though enough mental rehearsal might somehow produce a different outcome retroactively. This rumination doesn't extract any new information the first pass-through didn't already offer. It simply reinflicts the original pain, over and over, with no corresponding benefit. A pattern that, left unchecked, can consume enormous amounts of present-day energy and service, of a past that categorically cannot be changed by any amount of additional replaying. It's worth being precise about a distinction often blurred. Regret and guilt are related, but genuinely different experiences, and confusing them tends to produce the wrong response to each. Guilt is about having done something wrong to someone else. It implicates a moral failing and typically calls for accountability, repair, or amends where possible. Regret is broader and doesn't necessarily involve wrongdoing at all. Someone can deeply regret a career path, a missed opportunity, or a relationship allowed to fade without having done anything morally wrong in any of those situations. Applying guilt's framework, the need for repair, apology, penance, to a regret that involves no actual wrongdoing, tends to produce misplaced, unresolvable self-punishment for something that was never actually a moral failure to begin with. Just a choice that, in hindsight, turned out differently than a person might now prefer. Returning to the idea introduced earlier in this episode, examined honestly rather than avoided, regret offers a specific practical use. It clarifies, often more precisely than anything else available, what actually matters to a person. Picture someone who notices a recurring regret about not being present enough for their children during a demanding career phase. This regret, uncomfortable as it is, offers direct, actionable information. Presence with family matters more to this person than the career achievements that displaced it. This information remains useful going forward, even though the specific years already spent cannot be recovered. It can directly inform every choice still ahead. At some point, regret has to be met with a plain, difficult fact. Certain years, certain choices, certain windows of opportunity are genuinely, permanently closed, and no amount of wishing, replaying, or bargaining changes that reality. Picture someone who has spent years quietly hoping that enough regret, sincerely enough felt, might somehow retroactively alter a past decision. This hope, however understandable, is never actually granted, because time moves in one direction only. Accepting this fully, not with resignation, but with clear-eyed honesty, is often the necessary first step before any of the more useful uses of regret discussed in this episode become genuinely available. A specific, particularly painful version of regret involves comparing an actual, lived life against an idealized, unlived alternative. The version where the different choice was made, imagined in its best possible form, with none of the actual complications an alternate path would certainly have carried to. Picture someone imagining the relationship they didn't pursue as flawless, permanently happy, free of the ordinary friction every real relationship actually contains. This imagined alternative was never real, and comparing an actual, complicated life against a fictional, idealized one is not a fair comparison. It's a story constructed entirely in hindsight, stripped of the real difficulties the other path would have certainly included as well. Regret tends to shift in character as a person moves through different stages of life, and it's worth naming this directly, because the regrets of youth and the regrets that surface later often concern very different things. Picture the regrets common in early adulthood, often centered on specific decisions, specific paths not taken, still feeling relatively recoverable given remaining time. Compare this to regrets that tend to surface later in life, often broader, more oriented around how time itself was spent, relationships not deepened, presence not given, a more diffuse sense of years past, rather than any single identifiable choice. Understanding this natural shift helps make sense of why regret can feel different, and sometimes heavier, at different points in a life, and why addressing it well matters more, not less, as remaining time becomes a more finite and keenly felt resource. The most genuinely useful thing regret can produce, once it's been felt honestly, rather than avoided or drowned in, is direct, specific action in the time that actually remains available. Picture someone who deeply regrets a distant relationship with a sibling, allowed to drift over years of minimal contact. The years already past cannot be recovered, but the relationship itself, in the present, often still can be. A call made today, an effort renewed now, is fully available regardless of how many years were previously lost to distance. The regret, rather than being wasted on endless replay of the past, gets redirected toward the one thing actually still within reach. What happens from this point forward? A specific, often overlooked source of relief from regret involves recognizing honestly that past decisions were made with the information, resources, and level of understanding available at the time, not with the hindsight currently being used to judge them. Picture someone harshly judging a past decision, using knowledge and perspective they've only gained since. This is, in a real sense, an unfair comparison. Judging an earlier version of oneself by standards that version genuinely didn't have access to yet. This isn't an excuse for genuine negligence or wrongdoing, addressed more directly in an earlier episode of this series about forgiveness. It's a specific correction for the more common case, a reasonable decision made with the honest limitations of the time that simply turned out differently than hoped. There's a specific practical exercise worth naming directly, using current, present tense choices to deliberately reduce the regrets a person is likely to carry from this point forward, rather than only ever looking backward at regrets already accumulated. Picture someone asking themselves honestly, in a moment of hesitation about whether to take a meaningful risk or have an important, overdue conversation. Looking back on this from years from now, which choice am I more likely to regret? Trying and possibly failing, or never having tried at all? Given the pattern discussed earlier in this episode about inaction regrets typically outlasting action regrets, this question tends to tilt meaningfully toward action, in situations where the stakes of trying are genuinely survivable. There is a specific achievable peace available to anyone willing to look honestly at a past decision and conclude, truthfully, given what I knew, who I was, and what was available to me at that time, I did what made sense. Picture arriving at this conclusion, not through denial or minimizing what happened, but through honest, careful examination of the actual circumstances that produced a given choice. This isn't the same as pretending everything worked out perfectly. It's a specific earned peace that comes from judging a past self by the fair standard of what was actually knowable then, rather than the unfair standard of everything learned since. Like everything else explored throughout this series, making peace with regret is never accomplished in a single decisive moment. It's built the same quiet way discipline, patience, forgiveness, and every other quality discussed in this series are built, through small, repeated choices that rarely feel significant on their own. The regret examined honestly for what it reveals, rather than endlessly replayed for what it can't change. The still available relationship reached toward today, regardless of years already lost. The past self-judged fairly by what was known then, rather than what's known now. The present choice made with an honest eye toward which future regret is actually more survivable. None of it undoes the years already gone. Nothing can, and pretending otherwise was never the point. But it accumulates, quietly, into a life where the years that remain get spent with fuller awareness of what regret has already taught, rather than repeating the same unexamined pattern one more time. That is what to do with the years you can't get back. Not to recover them, but to finally let them teach you something useful about the years still ahead. If this reached you today, share it with someone who needs the reminder.